The day my mother had her stroke, I was 45 minutes away, elbow deep in mulch in my backyard, completely unaware that my entire family was about to fall apart. My phone rang 9 times before I finally pulled off my gloves and answered. It was the hospital. They said the words I had always dreaded but somehow never fully prepared for: massive ischemic stroke, left side affected, unconscious, come now. I dropped everything, drove 90 miles per hour on the freeway, and sat in that waiting room for 6 hours praying harder than I had ever prayed in my life. My sister Renee didn't show up until 4 hours later. She walked in with a coffee in her hand, sunglasses on top of her head, and looked at me like I was overreacting. She said the doctor told her over the phone that Mom was stable, so she didn't feel the need to rush. I remember staring at her and not being able to find a single word. That was the first moment something shifted in me, quietly, barely noticeable, like a crack in a wall that you don't see until the whole thing comes down. My name is Dana. I'm the younger of 2 daughters. My mother, Carol, raised us mostly alone after our father left when I was 6 and Renee was 11. Mom worked double shifts at a dry cleaning business for most of our childhood, came home smelling like chemicals and heat, made us dinner, helped with homework, never once complained. She bought a small house in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio when I was 12. She made the last mortgage payment the same year I graduated college. That house was her whole life's work. She used to say it like a joke, but she meant it every single time. That house is my retirement plan, my legacy, and my therapy all rolled into one. Renee and I were never particularly close. We're very different people. I stayed near Mom, visited twice a month, called every Sunday, took her to her doctor's appointments. Renee moved to Phoenix 15 years ago, started a real estate business, made decent money, and called Mom maybe once every 3 weeks. She wasn't cold exactly, she just had a version of family love that existed mostly in theory. She said the right things, she just didn't do very many of them. When Mom had her stroke, she was 68 years old and in otherwise reasonable health. The doctors told us she might recover a significant portion of her function with intensive rehab, but the first 4 to 6 weeks were critical. She needed round-the-clock care. The hospital moved her to a neurological ICU, and the plan was to eventually transition her to a rehabilitation facility for several months. I took 2 weeks off work immediately. I sat with Mom every single day. I coordinated with the nurses, asked questions the doctors probably got tired of, brought Mom her favorite magazines even though she couldn't read them yet, and played her the gospel music she loved on a small Bluetooth speaker. Renee flew back for 5 days in the first week, made a lot of noise about how she was taking charge, and then flew home saying she had listings she couldn't cancel. What I didn't know, what I had absolutely no idea about, was what Renee was doing from Phoenix while I was sitting in that hospital room. About 3 weeks after Mom's stroke, I started noticing things, small things at first. I went to check Mom's mail one afternoon using the spare key she had always given me, and the mailbox was empty. Not normal empty, completely cleaned out, like someone had recently cleared everything. I mentioned it to Renee on the phone and she said she had forwarded Mom's mail to herself so the box wouldn't overflow. I thought that was a little strange, but I didn't push back. Then one Sunday, one of Mom's neighbors, a woman named Vera who'd lived next door for 20 years, stopped me in the driveway and said something that made the bottom fall out of my stomach. She said, "Dana, I saw a man walking through your mom's house last Tuesday with a clipboard. Is Carol selling?" I told her no, of course not. Mom is in the hospital. That doesn't make any sense. Vera looked at me with that careful kind of concern that older women carry so gracefully and said, "Well, honey, there was a car parked out front for about 2 hours, a man in a suit. I figured you knew." I called Renee that night. She said it was probably just a contractor she had hired to give her an estimate on some maintenance items because she wanted the house to be in good shape while Mom was recovering. It sounded plausible. I wanted to believe it, but something, that small crack in the wall, had gotten a little wider. 2 more weeks passed. Mom was transferred to the rehabilitation facility. She could move her right hand and speak in short phrases, and the therapists were cautiously optimistic. I was at her side 4 times a week, sometimes more. During this whole period, Renee and I talked regularly on the phone, and she always sounded supportive and involved. She asked about Mom's progress. She sent flowers to the rehab center. She said all the right things. On a Thursday morning in late October, I drove to Mom's house to water her plants and pick up a few personal items she had asked for: her reading glasses, a specific prayer book, a photograph of her own mother. I pulled into the driveway, put my key in the front door, and the key didn't work. I stood there on that porch for a full minute just trying the key over and over like I was going insane. Same key I'd used 100 times, same lock, but it wouldn't turn. I walked around back and tried the back door. Same thing. I sat in my car in Mom's driveway feeling a cold kind of dread I had never felt before. I called Renee, no answer. I called again, no answer. I texted her, the locks are changed on Mom's house. What is going on? She texted back 40 minutes later, oh, I had those changed as a precaution while Mom's away. For security, I'll get you a key. She never got me a key. I started doing what I probably should have done a month earlier. I started paying attention. I pulled up the county auditor's website, the one you can use to search property records, and I typed in my mother's address. What I found made me grip the edge of my desk so hard my fingers went white. The property had been transferred. The record showed a deed transfer dated 11 days prior. The listed seller was Carol, my mother, but the transaction was handled through a limited power of attorney. The buyer was an LLC I had never heard of. The recorded sale price was $650,000. My mother's house had been sold. I sat in silence for so long that my computer screen went dark. My mother, who was in a rehabilitation facility, who could only speak in short sentences, who couldn't hold a pen steadily enough to sign her own name, had supposedly sold her house for $650,000 while she lay recovering from a stroke. And I had known absolutely nothing about it. The power of attorney was what broke me open completely. I knew Mom had a power of attorney document. She'd had one for years, just as a precaution. She'd always told me that both Renee and I were listed, that neither of us could act without the other's knowledge. I had seen the document once years ago, signed and notarized. What I didn't know was that there had been a second document, a new one, dated 6 months before the stroke, naming Renee as sole agent. When I found that out, when a paralegal friend helped me pull the document and read it to me over the phone, I had to sit down on my kitchen floor, because everything suddenly made terrible sense. The cleared mail, the contractor, the changed locks, the silence. Renee had spent months setting this up. She had gotten my mother, who trusted her completely, who would have signed anything Renee put in front of her with a pen and a smile, to sign a new power of attorney. And then she had waited, and when the stroke happened, she had moved fast. The money, $650,000, had gone into an account I had no access to. Renee had it. I want to be honest about what those days felt like because I don't want to skip over it. I was devastated in a way that felt almost physical. This was our mother's home, the place where I grew up, where the floors creaked in specific spots we all had memorized. Where Mom's garden still had the rose bushes she'd planted the year Dad left because she said she needed something that would bloom no matter what. That house was everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed for, everything she planned to leave to her daughters. And Renee had sold it, without telling me, without telling Mom in any real way, without any conversation, any warning, any conscience. I drove to the rehabilitation facility the next morning and sat with Mom. I didn't tell her yet. The doctors had warned us about emotional stress during this phase of her recovery. I held her hand and watched her do her speech exercises, and I kept it together, barely, by focusing on her face instead of everything churning inside me. On my way out, I stopped at the front desk and asked a few careful questions. I found out that Renee had visited Mom about 3 weeks after the stroke before I knew anything and had spent time with her in her room, just the two of them. The nurse remembered it because Renee had brought paperwork. Paperwork. While Mom was still in the ICU, barely conscious, Renee had brought paperwork. I hired an attorney 4 days later. Her name was Margaret, and she was a probate and elder law specialist who had the kind of calm, focused energy that made you feel like the world was at least navigable, even when everything felt impossible. I laid everything out for her: the power of attorney, the property transfer, the timeline, the LLC. She listened without interrupting, took notes in a small leather notebook, and when I was done, she looked at me and said, "This is a serious situation, but it's not hopeless." Margaret explained that the critical question was whether the power of attorney had been executed properly and whether my mother had the legal capacity to sign it. If Mom had been showing early signs of cognitive decline before the stroke, even subtle ones, that could affect the document's validity. She also said the timing of the property sale mattered enormously. Selling a property while the principal is incapacitated and in a hospital, using a power of attorney without notifying other family members or a court, is the kind of transaction that raises serious red flags for financial elder abuse. That phrase, financial elder abuse, landed like something heavy on a wooden floor. My sister, Renee, who I had shared a childhood with, who had eaten at the same kitchen table where Mom stayed up late paying bills, who had watched our mother sacrifice for decades, that Renee had committed financial elder abuse against our mother. I couldn't sleep properly for 2 weeks. Margaret filed an emergency motion to freeze the proceeds from the sale. She also filed a request with the probate court for an emergency conservatorship, which would give me legal authority to act on Mom's behalf and would strip Renee of whatever authority she still claimed under the power of attorney. The court moved quickly, faster than I expected, because the language Margaret used in the filing was precise and devastating. She had documented everything. The timeline, the suspicious transfer, Mom's medical condition at the time of signing, the new power of attorney that had appeared 6 months before the stroke. Renee called me 3 days after the motion was filed. It was the angriest I had ever heard her. She said I was betraying the family. She said she had done everything for Mom's benefit, that the house was a liability, that she had a plan to invest the money and provide for Mom's care. She said I was ungrateful and vindictive and that I had always been jealous of her relationship with Mom. She said she was going to fight me in court and she was going to win. I let her talk, I didn't argue. When she finally stopped, I said, "Renee, I have a lawyer, you should get one too," and I hung up. What I didn't tell her was what Margaret had already discovered during her research into the LLC that had purchased the house. The buyer, the LLC, was not a stranger. It was connected, through a web of registered agents and shell companies, to a real estate investment partnership that had Renee's business partner's name on its formation documents. In other words, Renee had sold our mother's house to people she was connected to, possibly at a below-market price arranged in advance, while our mother lay incapacitated. The investigating began to widen. Margaret brought in a forensic accountant. We subpoenaed bank records. What we found was a transfer of $650,000 into a joint account between Renee and that same business partner. Not a separate account for Mom's care, not a trust, not anything that resembled what Renee had claimed on the phone. The money had been moved to a joint account that Renee shared with someone who was not our mother. The conservatorship was granted on an emergency basis within 2 weeks of filing. I was named Mom's conservator. Renee's power of attorney was suspended pending a full hearing. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after I had first discovered the property transfer, there was a knock at my front door. It was a man in a dark overcoat with a briefcase. He introduced himself as an investigator with the county's Adult Protective Services Unit. He said they had received a referral from the court filing from Margaret's documentation and that they were opening a formal investigation into potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He was polite and thorough, and he asked me detailed questions for almost 2 hours. He photographed documents. He took copies of everything. I stood on my front porch watching him walk to his car afterward, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, not relief yet, something quieter, the sense that the truth was finally moving in the right direction. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Margaret worked to get the property transfer declared void. The argument was multi-layered. The power of attorney had potentially been obtained through undue influence, given that Renee had been the one to present it to Mom. Mom's capacity at the time of signing was questionable, given that she had experienced what her doctor later described as possible pre-stroke neurological events in the months prior. And the subsequent use of that power of attorney to sell the property to an entity connected to Renee herself was a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. Renee hired her own attorney, a good one, expensive, based in Columbus. The early letters her attorney sent were aggressive. They claimed the sale was entirely legal. They claimed Renee had Mom's full informed consent. They claimed I was a disgruntled sibling attempting to interfere with proper estate management. For a while there was a moment where I genuinely didn't know how this would go. But then Mom got better. Not fully, she would always walk with a slight drag in her left foot, and her speech in moments of fatigue would soften and slow. But cognitively she came back more than anyone had predicted. By December she was in a private room at the rehab center, doing 2-hour therapy sessions daily, reading her prayer book, talking to me in full sentences. And one afternoon, when the room was quiet and the winter light came in at a low angle through the window, I finally told her. I had planned to be gentle, I had rehearsed a careful version, but the moment I started talking, Mom's face changed, not with confusion, not with tears, but with a kind of slow, terrible recognition. She already knew something had happened, she had felt it. She said Renee had come to her in the hospital and told her she was taking care of things. She said Renee had told her it was routine paperwork, that she needed to sign some documents so the house bills could still be paid while she recovered. She said she'd had trouble reading the documents clearly. Her vision had still been affected at that point, and Renee had read them to her, had explained them, had handed her a pen and guided her hand. My mother started crying, not because she was weak, she was one of the strongest people I've ever known, but because she had trusted her daughter. She had looked at Renee's face, the face of her firstborn, and believed what she was told. I held her hand and let her cry, and then she wiped her face, straightened up, and said to me very clearly, "I want my house back." I cannot explain what it felt like to hear my mother say those words, after everything, after all of it. She said them like a woman who had worked her entire life for one thing and was not going to let it be taken without a fight. I squeezed her hand and said, "We're going to get it back." Margaret's team, combined with the forensic accountant's findings, built a case that was difficult to argue with. The power of attorney document showed Mom's signature, but a handwriting expert noted inconsistencies with her pre-stroke signature samples. Mom's medical records revealed that she had been prescribed medication in the months before the stroke that affected cognitive clarity, medication her neurologist confirmed could have impaired her ability to fully understand complex legal documents. In the timeline of Renee's actions, the mail forwarding, the contractor visit, the lock change, the LLC, painted a picture of someone who had been planning this for a long time. The Adult Protective Services investigation concluded with a formal finding of financial exploitation. That finding was forwarded to the county prosecutor's office. Charges were filed against Renee in late January: wire fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, breach of fiduciary duty, 3 separate charges, each carrying its own weight. The civil case moved in parallel. The court voided the property transfer on the grounds that it was executed through a power of attorney that had been obtained by undue influence and used in a manner that constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. The LLC, the buyer, had their own legal exposure, given the connection to Renee's business partner, and they did not fight hard to keep the property. Within a few months, the transaction was fully unwound. The title was returned to Mom's name. $650,000, the money that had sat in that joint account. Renee's attorney negotiated a return of the full amount plus costs as part of a civil settlement that allowed Renee to avoid certain findings in exchange for cooperation. She cooperated barely. She gave a deposition that her attorney had clearly coached every word of. She avoided looking at me the entire time. I sat across from her at that deposition table and I looked at her face. The same face I had grown up alongside, the face that had sat at the same dinner table, had shared the same mother, had grown up in the same house she had tried to steal, and I felt no anger. I want to be honest about that. I had expected to feel something sharp when that moment came, but what I felt was closer to grief, not for what I'd lost, but for what she had chosen to become. Renee took a plea agreement on the criminal charges. She was sentenced to 3 years probation, 100 hours of community service, a substantial fine, and is permanently banned from serving as a power of attorney or executor for any family member in the state of Ohio. Her real estate business suffered. The business partner dissolved their LLC and distanced himself quickly when the investigation went public. A local news outlet ran a brief story. I don't know exactly how much of her professional life was destroyed. I haven't spoken to her since the deposition. Mom came home in March. I was there when the car pulled up to the house. I had arranged for some friends to help me set things up: new grab bars in the bathroom, a hospital-grade bed in the downstairs room. For the first few months, her garden pruned and tended. The rose bushes had survived the winter, all of them, still standing in the side yard the way they always had. She walked up the front porch steps with her cane slowly, and she stopped at the door. She put her hand on the door frame and she stood there for a moment just breathing. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She stepped inside, looked around the living room, her furniture, her curtains, her photographs on the wall, her specific smell of lemon and old wood and something that has no name but is only ever called home, and she put a hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. Then she walked in and sat down in her chair, the worn green armchair she'd had for 30 years, and she said, "Put the kettle on, baby." I put the kettle on. There's something I've thought about a lot in the months since all of this happened. People will ask me if I hate Renee. The honest answer is no. What I feel is something harder to name, a kind of sorrow for how completely she had let greed become bigger than everything else. Bigger than loyalty, bigger than love, bigger than the memory of a woman who wore herself down to nothing so her daughters would have a good life. Renee had looked at all of that and seen a transaction. That is its own kind of devastation, and it belongs to her, not to me. What I hold on to instead is this: my mother is home. The house is in her name, her garden is blooming. On Sunday mornings, she sits in her green chair with her prayer book, and the light comes through the window the same way it always did, and she looks like a woman who fought for her life in more ways than one and came out the other side. I visit twice a week now, sometimes more. We drink tea. We talk about small things: the neighbors, the garden, a book she's reading, the state of the rose bushes. Sometimes she'll get quiet and look out the window, and I know she's thinking about Renee, about what that cost. I don't push. I just sit with her and let the silence be what it is. One afternoon last spring, she looked at me and said, "I'm sorry you had to do all of that." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She shook her head a little and said, "I should have seen it." I told her that love makes you trust people. I told her that's not a flaw, that's just what love does. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "The house is going to you when I'm gone. I already told the lawyer." I didn't say anything. I just leaned over and put my head on her shoulder the way I used to do when I was small and the world felt too big. She put her hand on my hair. Outside, the rose bushes were full and red and blooming in the afternoon light, unbothered by everything that had tried to cut them down. Some things hold.